Okay folks, so we're going to do a PowerPoint on George. George is a great character to answer on because there's so much that you can say about him. And remember, what we want to do is we want to think about relevant quotations associated with George, and then we want to be able to use our AO2 technical awareness to analyse those quotations. So this is the first time that George is described in the novella. And we have: the first man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined: small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin, bony nose. Now, what's interesting about this definition is how it is the opposite of Lennie's physical appearance. So what we want to do is try to point out the key words. So let's look at adjectives. Now we can say the adjective as our AO2 technique. Remember, technique does not have to consist of big fancy terms that are hard to spot and even harder to spell. We can limit it to such things as diction choices. In this case, we're going to look at adjectives. So look at the restless eyes. Now, what does that suggest? What is Steinbeck implying? And again, there's your AO2 term. Steinbeck implies. So with that adjective, restless, in relation to George's eyes, we get the sense that George is always aware, he's always alert. And we know that his eyes are restless, we know that he's alert because he is sensing danger. His life has been one where he moves from one situation of risk and danger to the next situation of risk and danger, and that is something that has been made possible, or that is something that is a result of his relationship with Lennie. So the restless eyes suggest this sense that George is always alert. He's always looking out for the next potential point of risk or the next dangerous event that he wants to try and avoid or escape. And he never really does, because this is a cycle of behaviour that he and Lennie are both trapped in. The cycle comes to an end in chapter 6, as we know, but at this stage those restless eyes are important because of what they imply. We also have the idea that he's small, he has strong hands, slender arms and a thin bony nose. Now, if you have watched the video on Slim, you will know that hands are important in the novel, that the use of references to hands can tell us a lot about a particular character in a particular situation. So he has strong hands but slender arms. Now those two things are oppositional, aren't they? Maybe strength and something being slender. You think about something being strong, quite masculine and muscular, but then slender perhaps suggests thinner, perhaps suggests a particular delicacy. And what we have here is the idea that by looking at those adjectives, we get a sense that George is a character who can combine different oppositional situations or different oppositional qualities. And that's something that we'll see as we go on. He's the first man. That's important. Why is it important? Because he's the leader. He's leading. Lennie will follow. And he is leading Lennie through life, trying to avoid the troughs that they fall into, the situations of danger that arise. He is the leader. Lennie is the follower. Oh, I just did that, but I actually want to move on to the next slide. So I'll see if that'll happen now. Okay, so let's think about the way George speaks to Lennie. So Steinbeck's use of dialogue. There's a nice AO2 for you. Dialogue. So George says, Lennie, for God's sake, don't drink so much. And what we get from this, for God's sake, don't drink so much. So the first thing that George does is he's trying to instruct, he's trying to guide Lennie. So he's the first man, so he's physically guiding him. But here with his dialogue, we get the sense that he's also trying to guide him through through their daily activities, how Lennie can adapt to this world that is hostile to him. So George has parental responsibility. He wants Lennie to learn how to behave in a safe manner. And I think that's important. For God's sake, don't drink so much. He wants to try and minimise the risk. The friendship is a close one, and George wants to protect Lennie from himself and from others. And here with the Lennie, for God's sake, don't drink so much. He is trying to look out for Lennie, trying to protect Lennie from Lennie's instinct. Lennie's thirsty, so he drinks, and he doesn't know where to stop. And again, we're going to see that so often as a recurring motif throughout the novella, that he doesn't know where to stop. A motif is a repeated image or a repeated event, and in this novella, the idea that Lennie doesn't know where to stop is a repeated motif. We see it with the petting of the mouse. We see it when he tried to touch the girl's dress in weed. We see it here with the water. We see it with the puppy, and of course we see it most tragically with Curley's wife. George, again, he stared morosely at the water. I gotta tell you again, do I? Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard. Now, remember, Steinbeck's detached style, so his writing is not full of imagery and wonderful descriptive passages that take us off in different imaginative ways. Instead, what he has is he's got quite a minimalist approach. His writing is detached, but what we do get is the importance of adverbs. So look at this adverb here. George stared morosely. Now, to be morose, or the adverb morosely, means to be sorrowful, so to be filled with sadness, to be sorrowful. And it's important that you realise that Steinbeck is introducing this undercurrent of sadness, this sense that George is a morose character. And why so? Because he is frustrated with his life and his responsibilities. So again, like that parent, George is a parental character. He operates as a parent, as a father figure to Lennie in their daily lives, and that causes him to become frustrated. And his sadness is a result of that frustration. If you look at the language here, so what's Steinbeck doing with dialogue here? Well, the language is profane, it's abusive, isn't it? Like he calls him a crazy bastard. Not really the language you would associate with friendship, or kind of a weird friendship, but what we have here is that George sometimes can be overwhelmed with Lennie's behaviour. Yes, he wants to do the right thing for him, and yes, he always will, but that doesn't mean he isn't affected by the friendship, that it doesn't get him down. And so the idea that we have that adverb morosely associated with George is an important one, because it lets us know about the inner sadness that this friendship brings. It stops him from being lonely. Yes, it stops him from being one of those guys that Slim talks about, the whole damn world's scared of each other. It stops him from falling into that category, but it also brings frustration, and sometimes that frustration is too much, and we get that from the use of dialogue here. There's your AO2, dialogue. Right, so let's look at this piece of dialogue here. I ain't got nothing to do, might just as well spend all my time telling you things, then you forget them and I tell you again. Now what Steinbeck is doing here is he's making it clear that there is a cycle of behaviour that is something that they both have accepted. This friendship means that they will constantly move from one situation of risk to another situation of risk. So their friendship is producing this cycle of behaviour that ultimately makes apparent that frustration and that idea that George speaks morosely that we had in the previous slide. So he tells Lennie something, then Lennie forgets, then George has to tell it again. And what we have here is a cycle of behaviour that will only end with the sacrifice being made in chapter 6. And so that cycle of behaviour, it produces a frustration that can sometimes overwhelm George, and we get that through his diction choices, you crazy bastard. But that cycle of behaviour, as frustrating as it is better than being lonely. Okay, and that key theme of loneliness through the novella is tackled here. So George would rather indulge in the cycle of behaviour with Lennie, even though it overwhelms him, even though that's expressed through diction choices, that's better than being lonely. And George says, you got to remember so we don't get in no trouble. So George is taking care of problems that will occur and will continue to occur, and he wants to protect Lennie and himself. So far, if you think about your AO2, what we've had the adjective restless eyes. Shows that he's always looking out for danger, wants to be protective of Lennie. Two, through his dialogue, we realise that Lennie doesn't know, or that George appreciates that Lennie doesn't know where to stop. And we got that with the idea about him drinking too much of the water. Three, you've had the use of that adverb morosely, creates this idea that there's an inner sadness within George. And why is that there? Because four, Steinbeck describes George and Lennie's relationship as a circle, cyclical behaviour that will always produce the same frustrating results. But five, that cyclical behaviour is preferential to being lonely, which is one of the key themes of the novella. And six, we have that idea that George's parental responsibilities are something that his parental responsibilities are responsibilities that he takes seriously. And we've got it here that you've got to remember, so we don't get into no trouble. He knows that problems will occur again and again, but he will always try to do the right thing for Lennie. Okay. Oh, and seven then, profanity. The profanity of the language used by George that Steinbeck attributes to George in dialogue. You crazy bastard. I think you can all remember that quotation, folks. I think that one will be one that will stick in your mind. But remember, it's that idea that it shows how, despite the keen nature of this friendship, it is a friendship that has disadvantages as well as advantages. This one's quite a good quotation though, because you crazy bastard, think I'd let you carry your own work card. It shows the paradox, the idea that George can bring oppositional states together. Remember, he has strong hands but slender arms, and you've got that sense of oppositional qualities. Well, here you have it in this one piece of dialogue, because George uses the abusive term crazy bastard there, which shows, that he gets frustrated, that he can become overwhelmed by Lennie. But also, think I'd let you carry your own work card. He's always protective. It reflects the relationship with Lennie because it's a mixture of concern and frustration. So that's actually a really good quotation, folks, to get into your mind. You crazy bastard, think I'd let you carry your own work card. Why? Because through the dialogue, through the abusive language, and through the dialogue itself, we can see the paradox at the heart of George's relationship with Lennie. It's a mixture of parental concern and deep frustration. Right, so let's think about some other AO2 terms here associated with George. Repetition and imperative verbs. Sure, don't we love them? Give it here, give it here. So your imperative verb, give, and it's repeated twice. So we've got two techniques there in one quotation, and it's quite an easy quotation to remember. And it shows that he has a sense of mastery over Lennie, that he can command Lennie, and that Lennie will obey. It's important because at chapter 3, remember when Curley is goading Lennie. Hold on, I'm going to have a wee drink of my tea. When Curley is goading Lennie, when Curley is fighting Lennie and Lennie won't fight back, and Lennie doesn't fight until George shouts, "Get him, Lennie!" And then when the order is given, Lennie reacts to that order. And here we have the order being given. It's sharp, it's abrupt, but it's being done because there's an underlying compassion there. George wants the right thing for Lennie. He wants to try and protect Lennie from himself. But it's important to realise, and we'll talk more about this when we're doing Lennie, it's important to realise that Lennie can manipulate George as well. And I'm not going to go into the Lennie bit here. I'll do that when we're revising Lennie by himself. But it says, Lennie avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you just gotta say so, and I'll go off into those hills right there, right up in those hills, and live by myself. And I won't get no mice stole from me. Oh, God bless him. And then George says, I want you to stay with me, Lennie. Jesus Christ, somebody would shoot you for a coyote if you was by yourself. No, you stay with me. So Lennie is manipulating George here. Lennie wants the idea of their emotional attachment confirmed. He wants to know that George wants him. He wants to know that George is re-establishing that emotional connection, and so he does it. He says, oh, if you don't want me, I'll go off, just like you may do sometimes. Go upstairs and huff, oh, I'm not going to do what you say, and then you go upstairs and huff, and all you want is somebody to come and knock on your bedroom door and say, look, it's okay. Well, that's what we have here. We have Lennie as that sort of sulky teenager wanting George to show that he cares, and George does. I want you to stay with me. Now, how explicit is that? I want you to stay with me. That can't be, that can't be misconstrued. That's so clear. And George says, no, you stay with me. And that's important. George wants the emotional connection. George wants to re-establish it too. Lennie isn't manipulating George, but George wants to make it clear that he cares for Lennie. And he's not scared of saying that he cares. I want you to stay with me. Right, now, this is about their connection. And let's look at it here. So, George's voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically, as though he had said them many times before. Well, of course he said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They ain't got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and then they go into town and blow their stake, and the first thing you know, they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to. So why does George put up with Lennie? Why does George put himself through the frustration? Well, this is why he puts himself through the frustration, because if he is with Lennie, he's not like one of these guys. He's not. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. Guys, that's a brilliant quotation for you to use, really, for any character, because loneliness is a theme that just seeps through this novella, and everybody is impacted by loneliness. So guys like us that work on the ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. Now, if you were going to use that quotation, what technique would you align it to? Well, you could just go for dialogue. Or you could go for that superlative, the loneliest guys, that there is a unique quality to their loneliness. It's a loneliness, and it's an emptiness, and it's a purposelessness. Isn't that a great word with lots of syllables? But it is a sense of having no purpose. They've got nothing to look forward, no hope, no chance of a better life. But for George and Lennie, that's not their existence, because they have each other. The guys who are the loneliest that work on the ranch, that superlative, they ain't got no family. But George and Lennie are family. They're each other's family. Not through blood, but through compassion and love. And George's voice becomes deeper, so we know that it means something to him. His voice becomes deeper, and he repeated his words rhythmically, as if he had said them many times before, and we know that he has. This is the start of the prelude to talking about the dream. That there is a physical change that comes over him, because the dream is so needed, it's so desired, has such a spiritual dimension for George and Lennie, that when he speaks of it, it's almost like a mantra. Do you remember we talked about that? Oh, sorry guys, that's really thick, but you know what I mean. When we talk, it's almost like a mantra, it's almost like a prayer. It has a spiritual dimension. Now, watch the video on the dream itself. That you can watch that on the dream itself. That's an important one. So I'm not going to go too much into the dream in this PowerPoint, because you've got a whole dream PowerPoint to yourself. Whoopie do! How lucky are you? So this is then George and Lennie getting ready to go to the ranch and to immerse himself in this new life there. And he says to Lennie, you just stand there and don't say nothing. If he finds out what a crazy bastard you are, we won't get no job. And again, look, that abusive language and that quotation that you can use. And here again shows the paradox of the relationship. Remember, we had the paradox of relationship the last time crazy bastard was used. You crazy bastard, do you think that I'd let you look after your own card? And here we have another sense of opposites colliding within George. George is a paradoxical character. So what we have here is there's frustration but concern, and that's crucial, and we've talked about that before. The sense of reliance is made evident, reference to them as a unit. We won't get no job. So even though Lennie's the one who's the crazy bastard, George will be impacted because of that. And they are this unit. So Steinbeck uses pronouns. There's your AO2. He uses we won't get no job to show that they operate as a unit, no matter how difficult the situation, that there's loyalty there. Who else can use we, really, when you think about it, on the ranch, apart from George and Lennie? Candy perhaps talking about his dog, but nobody else has that close unit, that loyalty, that emotional connection with another human being. George and the boss. Okay, so George broke out loudly. Oh, I ain't saying he's bright, he ain't, but he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up 400 pound bail. So what we have here is that when George is speaking to the boss about Lennie, what he does is he tries to promote what Lennie can feel justifiably proud of. He's a goddamn good worker. And his strength there is shown as a quality that he can be proud of, that George is proud of, that Lennie is proud of. And then you've got here, what you have is you've got that terrible irony. I need to try and work out how to do this thinner, but you've got that terrible irony that here, when George is talking to the boss, he promotes Lennie's strength as a quality that is positive, and it's Lennie's strength that will ultimately undermine everything that George and Lennie have ever desired. His strength is a positive here, yes, but his strength is the ultimate negative when he unfortunately can't control it. And we'll see that with the puppy, and we've already seen that with the mouse, and then we'll see it most tragically with Curly's wife. Okay, so the boss deliberately put the little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted, one eye nearly closed. Say, what you selling? Huh? I said, what stake you got in this guy? You taking his pay from him? No, course I ain't. Why you think I'm selling him out? Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I'd just like to know what your interest is. So when George meets the boss is immediately on guard. Why? Because I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another. So the boss doesn't understand the emotional connection between George and Lennie. He says, say what you selling, i.e. what is it? What trick are you trying to pull? What are you trying to manipulate here? And I think that if you think of that diction choice, selling there, what it does is it tells you that for the boss, everything comes down to economics, everything comes down to money and comes down to profit. Therefore, the only reason why two people would be together is because there's some advantage in it, some economic advantage to be gained, one person to gain off another, a parasitical relationship, a relationship where George is exploiting Lennie's strength in order to get George's wages. That's something that the boss can understand, but he can't understand a symbiotic relationship, i.e. a relationship where two people benefit from being with each other on a level that's something beyond economics, that's on an emotional level, a psychological level, a spiritual level. And that's what we have with George and Lennie, that the reason why George takes so much trouble for Lennie is because their relationship is one where they mutually benefit. And the boss just doesn't understand that. He lives in a world where that sort of emotional connection does not take place. The ranch is a sterile environment for emotion. It's a whitewashed building. And if you think about the big A3 sheets that I gave you about different settings, you can look at it and see how the ranch is described as being a place that's emotionally sterile, it's a place that has little personality and does not allow the men to develop their personalities therein or to connect with each other. And that's what the boss just doesn't understand. It's interesting too. I'd like to know what you're interested in. And you could say interest also is part of that semantic field to do with profit. Okay, so here's big bad Curly, who's actually just short bad Curly. So Curly and George, we just come in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lennie twisted with embarrassment. George said, suppose he doesn't want to talk. George said, Lennie, I'm scared I'm going to tangle with that bastard myself. I hate his guts. Jesus Christ, come on. Right, George isn't behind the door, is he? He tells you to your face, except he doesn't tell Curly to Curly's face, he tells it to Lennie. But the key thing is the language associated with Curly here shows George's instinct that he knows that Curly is a threat, that he knows Curly is someone that he needs to be wary of. And so through his language, through his dialogue here, I hate his guts, tangle with that bastard, what we get is that George can sense the threat, and the threat immediately makes him hostile. But the hostility between George and Curly is clear there with Curly. Let the big guy talk. So Curly believes that he can command Curley believes that he can develop this moment of introduction in whatever way he wishes to, and the way that he wants to do that is aggressive, it is truculent, it's on his terms, and he wants his power and his authority to be made apparent. However, what you have to remember with Curley is that Curley doesn't have any power and authority beyond that of who his dad is, and so that power is a vicarious one. It's through his father that he has any status on the ranch, not through his own person, his own the qualities that he can possess. He's completely opposite to somebody like Slim, whose authority is accepted because of who he is and who he is internally, his own qualities, not just because he is usurping the power or he is assimilating the power of somebody else. In this case, it's always Curley and his dad. Curley would have nothing if Curley were by himself, but it's because of who his father is that Curley has the ability to say, let the big guy talk, to think that he can order George on their very first meeting. Okay, so you've had that aggressive reaction to Curley. George's diction choices in relation to Curley are quite profane and abusive. You know, I hate his guts. I'm going to tangle with the bastard. So what we have here is an equally negative introduction with Curly's wife. Now remember, when we looked at Curly's wife, when we did the video on Curly's wife, I thought about the symbolism of how when she appears she blocks out the light. So we know that she's going to be a negative force in relation to George and Lennie. And George looked around at Lennie and said, Jesus, what a tramp. She's pretty, said Lennie defensively. Lennie still stared at the doorway where she had been. Gosh, she was pretty. He smiled admiringly. George looked quickly down at him, and then he took him by the ear and shook him. Listen to me, you crazy bastard, he said fiercely. Don't even take a look at that bitch. Oh my gosh, isn't that language crazy? Anyway, so what does this tell us about George? Well, first of all, what are we going to pick out? So we need to pick out things that we can link to a particular technique. So let's look at George's dialogue. Jesus, what a tramp. Okay. Don't even take a look at that bitch. Okay, let's look at those two things. And again, repetition of you crazy bastard. So George repeats that phrase several times in relation to Lennie. And he does it when he's frustrated with Lennie and he senses that there is danger. And he understands that Curly's wife represents danger. And so when he speaks about her, so the words that he uses to describe Curly's wife are all negative, they're all abusive, and they're all linked in many ways to her sense of being a sexual threat. What a tramp. Now, a tramp is a woman who would have lots and lots of relationships with men. Look at that bitch. Again, it's an abusive term for a woman, perhaps suggests that sexual threat as well. So when we're thinking about the language that George uses for Curly's wife, when George is introduced to Curly and Curly's wife, the language that he uses is negative, it's abusive, and it results from the understanding that George sees both of these people as a threat. Curly's threat is because of his aggression and who his father is, and Curly's wife is a threat because of her sexuality and her ability to use her physicality to attract others. Remember, she's not doing it because she's a tramp. George doesn't understand Curly's wife. He makes judgments that are prejudicial, but what she actually is a very lonely woman who's trying to get attention in the only way that she knows that will work. Now, it's so important that you realise there's a completely different tone. Steinbeck uses a completely different tone when Slim is introduced to George and Lennie. And as I said in the dialogue, in the video about Slim, the adverb kindly is used for the first time in relation to someone meeting George and Lennie when Slim meets George and Lennie, because he does look upon them kindly. He doesn't need to ask, what are you selling, like the boss does. He doesn't need to command, let the big guy talk, like Curley does. Instead, what he does is he just accepts and he listens. Sure, said George, we kind of look out for each other. Now, we kind of look out for each other. That's the essence of their relationship. They do. And also, think of how he phrased that. We kind of look out for each other. Not I kind of look out for him. But again, that reference to the pronoun we, that they operate as a unit, that they both benefit from this relationship. He indicated Lennie with his thumb. He ain't bright. Hell of a good worker, though. Hell of a nice fella, but he ain't bright. I knew him for a long time. And Slim looked through George and beyond him. And I think that's important, and we do talk a little bit about that with the other video on Slim, that he looks through him, i.e. he understands him. Remember, you've got that simile in relation to Slim, his godlike eyes, so he can look at George and see what is within him, not just what he externally represents. Ain't many guys travel around together, he mused. I don't know why, maybe the whole damn world is scared of each other. It's a lot nicer to go around with a guy you know, said George. And again, George, when he needs to be, is very clear. I want you to stay with me, Lennie. We kind of look out for each other. It's a lot nicer to go around with a guy that you know. So, George isn't scared of being clear. He's not scared of declaring that their friendship is something that he needs, and that they operate as a unit. Okay, so chapter 3, George in chapter 3 and Slim. Now, again, if you want the Slim version of this, then you go watch the Slim video. So this is just focusing on George. So George spoke proudly. Just tell Lennie what to do and he'll go and do it, if it don't take no figuring. So again, adverbs. Adverb here, proudly. So he's proud of what Lennie can achieve. And remember, there's not much that Lennie can achieve. He is limited. But the skill that he has and the strength that he has, those two things together, they can be something that George can rightly be proud of, that George can say, yeah, that's what he can do. And he does this in a paternalistic way, like a father would, And so that adverb, proudly, that George uses when speaking of Lennie to Slim is an important one. It shows the parental pride that he has within Lennie, and it also shows that he understands Slim will accept that Slim will not question it, and that Slim will understand how George feels. He ain't no cuckoo, said George. He's as dumb as hell, but he ain't crazy, and I ain't so bright neither, or I wouldn't be bucking barley for my 50 and found. Now this is important, because what you have here is the idea that he's as dumb as hell. So he uses the simile that he's as dumb as hell, not to belittle Lennie, but to again help Slim understand. So he clarifies his mental weakness rather than his instability. So he's not clever, but he says, oh, he's not clever, but I'm not clever either. So what he does is he compares himself to Lennie in order to make it seem as if Lennie is not so mentally unstable or so crazy as to be someone that you would be scared of. So what we have here is that George lessens his own status. He has this self-deprecation. He lowers his own status and his own strength to draw less of a distinction between him. Now that's a very between himself and Lennie. That's a very loyal thing to do. That's a very unselfish thing to do. But George is loyal and unselfish. So that quotation, but he ain't crazy and I ain't so bright neither. The fact that he does that he compares himself with Lennie in order to make Lennie seem make Lennie seem perhaps less of a threat, and to minimise the distinction between the two of them is an act of loyalty, selflessly so. But remember, ultimately, the selflessness of George we'll see in chapter 6. Now, I'll talk about this more when we're doing Slim, so I'm only going to do this for a wee second. So George looked over at Slim and saw the calm, godlike eyes fasten on him. And what we have here, folks, is that George in this particular point at the start of chapter 4, George feels guilty, and what he wants to do is he wants absolution. He wants somebody else to understand that guilt and perhaps to take that guilt off his shoulders. And with Slim, he sees somebody who's capable of that, somebody who's capable of understanding George and understanding Lennie. And that links back to what Steinbeck's trying to do in this novella, because if you understand a person, it's most likely going to lead to love and not hate. That's what Steinbeck wants to do. That's what he said he wanted to do. And it's what we see here, that George understands that Slim's godlike eyes could perhaps give him that sense of absolution, could lift that burden of guilt off his shoulders, because he just wants somebody else to know what he did, and he knows he feels guilty for it, and to free him from that blame, exculpate, to get rid of that blame. And he goes on further. I could have beat the hell out of him, and he could have bust every bone in my body just with his hands, but he never lifted a finger against me. And George's voice was taken on the tone of the confessional. So there it's made explicit, the idea that George is trying to open up to the godlike eyes of Slim, because he knows that Slim will understand him. So you have this physical cruelty, that, George was physically cruel. He played tricks upon him. He nearly drowned poor Lennie. But the violence of the language there perhaps suggests the level of cruelty that George was capable of, and that he now feels that he wants to be freed from that blame, or freed from that guilt that weighs heavy upon his shoulders. And the tone of the confessional is a key way of understanding that for George, speaking to Slim is an opportunity for him to open up. He's not denying who he was and what he did, but he wants somebody else to understand it. So this is the bit where he damn near drowned poor Lennie. He damn near drowned before we could get him, and he was so damn nice to me for pulling him out. Clean forgot I told him to jump in. Well, I ain't done nothing like that no more. So the expression of guilt is clear here, and it's an epiphany for George. This moment was an epiphany. It was an eye-opener. It was something that made him change his behaviour. And what made him change his behaviour? The result of poor Lennie's kindness. So Lennie's kindness, and then that's an important thing too, because it shows you, it shows you a particular quality within Lennie that will always engender sympathy. Even though Lennie was told to jump in, when George tried to save him, all Lennie could do was thank him. So what it does is it makes the reader clearly feel sympathetic towards Lennie, and that sympathy is important, because when we get to chapter 6, you want to feel sympathetic for him, and you want to feel sympathetic for poor George, who has to make this ultimate sacrifice. George understands his meanness, and he's tried to make amends for it, and his relationship with Lennie is one where he's constantly trying to make amends for his original meanness. But that's not the only foundation of the relationship. The relationship is now one where they both benefit. It's not guilt that keeps George with Lennie. It's the idea that being with him fends off that terrible loneliness. The loneliest guys, remember that, but they can't be the loneliest guys if they're together. And loneliness becomes clear here. I ain't got no people, George said. I seen the guys that go around in the ranches alone. That ain't no good. So the idea that he doesn't have anybody else, and therefore Lennie is his family. He doesn't want to be like one of the loneliest guys, and therefore his relationship with Lennie is so important to him. What's important here, though, more than that, is that ain't no good. That phrase, that ain't no good. We have it here in chapter 3, and we'll have it again in chapter 6. Here George is saying it to Slim. Sorry, we'll have it again in chapter 5, beg your pardon. So here George is saying it to Slim, that ain't no good. But in chapter 5, Slim will say the exact same phrase to George, in relation to the fact that they have to go and get Lennie. So the phrase here is the fact that George and Slim say the same phrase to each other is another way of showing how these characters are parallel characters, that they represent similar qualities of understanding, dignity, respect, and a sense of morality that goes beyond that of anybody else on the ranch. Dumb bastard like he is, he wants to touch everything he likes, just wants to feel it. So again, what we see here is a mixture of frustration and concern. He's concerned that people would misconstrue what Lennie was up to, and he wants to make it clear that he's just acting in a childlike way, that he likes to touch soft things, but he's also frustrated, and that frustration comes through by again using that abusive term bastard. It's not crazy bastard, it's a variety on it today, it's dumb bastard. And what we have is this juxtaposition between the adult language and the childlike act. And the childlike act is to touch everything that he likes. Again, we have this idea that Lennie is linked to his instincts, and it's his instincts that unfortunately cannot be controlled. Here, it's to touch soft things, and we know how that ended badly in Weed. Right, chapter 3 then, the important thing now. Also, chapter 3 is that huge big chapter where you have George and Lennie in the dream, but I'm not going into it here with George because you've got a separate video on that, so go and watch George in the dream so you can take what you need from that. But here we have, after that, we have the fight, and you have get him, Lennie. Now remember, we've had the use of the imperative verb previously. We've had it on this slide here with give it here, give it here in relation to demanding that might in chapter 1, and here you have another imperative, get him, Lennie. And remember, Lennie is willing to take every blow that Curley meets out in, because he doesn't know how to react. He hasn't been instructed to react. But here, once he's told to react by George, you get the sense of this is the master and the dog, that he's responsive to orders, that he doesn't act out of his own volition. So Lennie doesn't protect himself, he only acts when George tells him to act. And George is there to protect Lennie. And so he says, get him, Lennie, because he wants Lennie to protect himself. Now, chapter 4, George doesn't figure in chapter 4 really, only towards the end, because he has gone with Slim into town, and that idea of leaving Lennie alone because George has gone with Slim, what that does perhaps is foreshadows how relationships will change at the end of the novella, because the closeness between George and Slim is something that we hope they will be able to develop further when the novella ends, and we'll talk about that when we look at that last stage. But here we're going to think about the 3 most important things associated with George once George is brought in to see Curley's wife's body. Remember, it's Candy who does that. So it says that his hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. So when he comes back in, he hides his eyes. He hides remember, the eyes are the window to the soul. It's through your eyes that people will understand what's really going on. And so George has his hat so far down his forehead that his eyes are covered. Now this is repeated twice. And the reason why it's there is because we get the sense that he needs to hide his emotions. So he's not hiding because he's worried about what he wants to do. He has to hide the emotion that this terrible event has created with him. So you get this idea that what is to come, the emotion for the moment, finding that Curly's wife has died and that he has to go and do this thing, but also the emotion of what to come is, I have to go and shoot my best friend. So the idea of hiding his eyes lets you know that the emotion that George is battling with is something that he wants to hide from others. Now, in relation to this, Slim has talked about what will happen to Lennie if the others get him, and they'll put him in a cage, and he says, that ain't no good, George. Remember that phrase, we repeated it from chapter 3 when George says it to Slim, and now Slim says it back to George. And here what you have is deliberate understatement. I know, said George, I know. So the use of litotes, there's your AO2, he uses litotes. Slim has used it as well to talk about what will happen, and if you go back to your Slim presentation you'll see that. But here he uses this understatement, I know, which he repeats, and what it does is he understands the absolute trauma and tragedy of this situation and what will have to be done about it. but he states it simply, I know, I know. So the understatement that he uses reflects the understatement that Slim has used previously, and it shows that both men are thinking alike. Again, we get this idea that they are parallel characters. They are characters that reflect the similar qualities. So Slim has said, that ain't no good, George, and I talked about that there. That's exactly the same phrase that George had used in relation to Slim. Okay, and when George is leaving the barn, knowing what he has to do, his feet dragged heavily. Now, I think this is really a really telling use of your verb and adverb here, because that idea of heavy dragging feet, that's something that's more befitting of Lennie than George, and it emphasises the impact of the events and the burden upon, the burden events the burden that has been created by these events. So he is dragging his feet. He's weighed down by the trauma of the situation and by the knowledge that he has of what he's about to do. So the impact of the events upon him are made clear here by the use of this adverb heavily, and it is an adverb that would be more obviously used towards Lennie. So it shows you that there's a change has occurred within George, and George knows now that he is the one who has to act in this final way to protect his friend. Okay, so the ultimate sacrifice comes in chapter 3, where we have the idea that George is going to have to do the right thing. And we've talked about sacrifice in relation to Slim, so this is the third sacrifice, and if you can't remember what the other two are, go watch the Slim PowerPoint. So Lennie has been having his hallucinations. You remember, he's got the big talking rabbit and he's got his aunt, but it is George who arrives to free Lennie from those hallucinations and calms down Lennie. And when Lennie says that he's done a bad thing, George says, it don't make no difference. And that's such a telling phrase, because what does it mean? It means that there could only ever have been one outcome. It doesn't matter what Lennie ever did. It was always going to end this way. There could never be any other solution. It's inevitable, and there's a terrible pessimism about that. But it was inevitable that this would happen. And when we think back to how Steinbeck showed it would be inevitable, right back in chapter 1, George told Lennie what he had to do if he got into trouble, that he had to go and hide in the brush. And here he is hiding in the brush. And so we know that it was always going to end this way, and George accepts that. Okay, Lennie wants George to go over the same dream routine if I was alone, but this time it's different, and we know it's different because of the adverb that Steinbeck uses, woodenly. So when George speaks, he speaks woodenly, i.e. there's no heart in it, there's no emotion anymore, there's no belief. Every other time that they talked about the dream, there was a belief that it could happen, and that reached its apex in chapter 3 when Candy came on board and he brought the funds to make it happen. And remember, if you're not sure about that, go watch the video on the dream. But now he speaks woodenly, that AO2 term. He knows that the hope is gone, there's only one thing that's left to do, the dream, the friendship, all of that is over, and there's an ultimate sadness. So let's think of two adverbs that have been linked to George and sadness. One, when he spoke morosely, and now when he speaks woodenly. Which is worse? Woodenly, because there's nothing left. It's wooden, it's hollow, there's no hope. And Lennie, unfortunately, it's fortunately for Lennie, Lennie doesn't understand that there's a difference. Who picks up on the difference? You do, the reader. You understand the difference, but poor Lennie doesn't. Lennie's so happy to hear it that he cries out in triumph and he giggles. And just that idea of him giggling reinforces his innocence. And what we have is, there's this ironic moment of triumph before the ultimate defeat. So he cries out triumph that yes, that he can remember his part in the dream. But it's not a triumph. It's a terrible, terrible defeat, because George and the reader know. We know what's going to happen now. We know that. And you've got that sense of dramatic irony, Steinbeck using dramatic irony, because you, the reader, know, George knows, but Lennie doesn't. Voices are heard and they're coming closer, and what does that do? Well, it really has to force George to act, and to act now. And Steinbeck is by having the idea of the voices being heard and the voices coming closer, that's Steinbeck's development of tension. We are moving towards the climactic ending here. It's inescapable. George has nothing else to do but pull that trigger, and that force of the force and the pressure and the tension is all being built up by the idea of these voices becoming closer and closer. Oh gosh, this is cut off, folks. Sorry about that. But what we have to do is just think about the physical effects on George. So when he speaks, he speaks shakily, okay? He can't mask his feelings. So he speaks woodenly, he speaks shakingly. It says for a moment he was businesslike. That's really important if you think about that compound adjective there. He's businesslike. I have to do this. And that maybe relates back to Slim. Whenever Candy looked at him in chapter 3 to try and prevent the death of the dog, he looked at Slim to find some way of escaping it. And the short phrase, and Slim gave none, that short sentence, and Slim gave none, is Slim being businesslike and deciding this has to happen. And here, again, at a moment of sacrifice, George is businesslike. His hand shook, okay, physically incapable of harming Lennie. He harmed him in chapter 3. Well, he told Slim of how he harmed him in the past and how he would never do that again. And yet here what he has to do is he has to make himself do that. So his hand shook. He's physically incapable of harming Lennie, and the verb is needed to make his body be as determined as his mind. He drops his hand. He's reluctant to act physically. He's not steeled. He's not ready to do it yet. He's battling his emotions. Now again, that relates back to Slim in chapter 3, because remember that lovely image in chapter 3 where Slim had to subdue one hand with the other. So he had to purposefully hold his hand down to stop himself from reacting and saying, no, don't kill the dog. Well, again, here we have the idea of hands. George's hand drops because he is battling with his emotions, just as Slim did in a very subtle way in chapter 3. Okay, so this last little bit, oh, this is so sad. No, said George, no, Lennie, I ain't mad. I've never been mad, and I ain't now, and that's a thing I want you to know. The voices came close now. George raised the gun and listened to the voices. Lennie begged, let's do it now, let's get the place now, sure, right now, we gotta. Okay, so look at that. Lennie begged. Now think about it. You could take from this the idea that Lennie is begging him to do it. Of course, Lennie doesn't know what's going to happen, but you, the reader, do. So you've got the dramatic irony there that you could use. It perhaps suggests that for Lennie's sake, he's begging him to do it. But this is the bit that I love. Sure, right now, we gotta. So I've got to, we gotta. Now, what have we had all the way through here? We've had George associated with the pronoun we, that they operate as a unit. We gotta do this. So you gotta help me, Lennie, and I've got to do this. I've got to do this for you. So right until the end, he operates as that unit. We gotta. If there's a quotation that you've got to stick in your head in relation to George, try to think about that. We gotta. George in the use of pronouns. George in the use of pronouns with we. They're part of a unit. He always sees them as that, even right here at the very end. And George raised the gun and steadied it. So when he says we gotta, when he goes back to the idea of what does this unit need, he steadies the gun. That gives him the strength. I'm doing this for you. I'm not doing this for me. That is what gives him the strength. And he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lennie's head, and his hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied. Now look at that. That's determination. His hand steadies. His face was set. Remember that compound adjective? Businesslike. He pulled the trigger. Now look at that simple sentence. How dramatic and powerful is that? He did it. Why did he do it? Because we gotta. He did it for them. The crash of the shot rolled up the hill and rolled down again. Lennie jarred and then settled slowly forward to the sand, and he lay without quivering. George shivered and looked at the gun, and then he threw it from him, back out on the bank. near the pile of old ashes. Oh, God bless, look at that. So George is shivered, the physical impact on that, and he throws the gun near a pile of old ashes. Now think of the symbolism there, the ashes of their friendship, the ashes of their dream, the ashes of their hope. Oh, hey, isn't that powerful? Okay, so when the voices finally arrive, when Curly and Carson arrive, Curly immediately goes and looks at the body, but Slim comes and looks at George, and I talk more about this on the Slim PowerPoint, but Slim says to George, a guy got to sometimes, and again, that's the absolution. That's the, I understand why you did it and you had to do it. Remember in chapter 3 when George spoke to the godlike eyes of Slim looking for absolution. Here, he didn't have to speak to get the absolution. It was given immediately. A guy got to sometimes. And Slim sits close to George, and we have that idea that they end as these parallel characters sitting close together, perhaps suggestive of a relationship or a friendship that can develop beyond here. And for God's sake, that's what we want for George. We want them to have that connection with Slim. We don't want him now to be one of the loneliest guys. So Slim knows that the sacrifice was necessary. He agrees with it, and when he says to him, "A guy got to sometimes," he's sanctioning it. He's saying, "I absolve you from guilt. We know what I know why you did it." Okay, let's look at the exit then between George and Slim. So George lies. He lies that Lennie had the gun. Lies to Carlson, and this is the very first time that George puts himself before Lennie. He lies to protect himself, and that's an important thing. Because he's never done that. He's always lied to protect Lennie, but here he lies to protect himself. And we have this role reversal because it's Slim that leads George away. So let's have a little look at that. Oh, I thought I put the final quotation in, but I hadn't. But if you go back to the Slim PowerPoint, I have it on that. So the key thing is for George. George so it's that it uses that diction choice. George lets Slim help him up, and then Slim leads George away for a drink. And the key thing is we have this sense of role reversal, that just as George led Lennie, the very first time we saw George, he was the first man. Here, Slim is the first man who now leads a weakened George. And what we have, if we think about the cyclical nature of this novella, in one way we've stopped the cycle because Lennie is gone, so the cycle has stopped in that way. But we hope that the cycle continues, that for example it is now Slim who leads and George who will follow, and we hope that for him. There he is there. Okay, so that's George.